And the people of Venezuela have voted. They want President Nicolas Maduro to stay in power. Now, that should be enough for any country to move to the next phase of their democracy, but not for the U.S., who is pushing again for regime change in resource-rich Venezuela, creating a source of instability in that country and for its economy. Hi, I'm Kavatafway. Welcome to Economic Divide. Some of the highlights coming up in today's program. The elections for the presidency of Venezuela. The incumbent Maduro won 51% of the votes. Opposition candidate Gonzalez garnered 44%. But the U.S. is disputing the election, calling it a fraud. The U.S. is after regime change in Venezuela. The U.S. claims that these groups funded by the U.S. government is what the reference point is. It includes fake ballots, dead people. Massive pro-Maduro protests, however, make the story in favor of Maduro. Then Venezuelan resources, perhaps that is at the center of a U.S.'s focus on Venezuela. Oil and gas is what the U.S. is after. The U.S. is sanctioning Venezuela in order to prevent economic advancement. That is called economic terrorism. Venezuela's presidential election had a winner, the incumbent President Nicolas Maduro. Garnering over 50% of the vote compared to his opponent and opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, Venezuelans were cheering for having Maduro in power. But that was dampened by the U.S., in which it argued against the election result, calling it a sham election.
We've seen the announcement just a short while ago by the Venezuelan Electoral Commission. We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people.
The U.S. referenced American-based sources funded by the U.S. State Department and associated with the CIA to make its case that Maduro had lost and that Gonzalez had won with an overwhelming margin. This was enough to send some Venezuelans out to the streets to protest. Even though Maduro's counter-protests brought out millions of protesters and towered over the protest by Gonzalez followers, all fingers were pointing to the U.S. for going after another regime change effort in the Latin American country. This is while Venezuelans had paid their dues from years of unfair U.S. sanctions and had seen their economy finally pick up in the past few years with a positive GDP growth. The U.S. anti-Maduro stance was countered by other Latin American countries, like Brazil, which accepted the election results and congratulated Maduro for his win. This is a section that we take a look at social media posts, and we have quite a few of them today. First up, breaking. At that point it was breaking. USA finds new Juan Guaido. The U.S. has officially recognized the victory of Maduro's rival in the Venezuelan elections. The U.S. State Department considers opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia to be the winner of the presidential election, according to reports in the media citing an official statement. Well, U.S. government-linked firm is the source of the exit poll, claiming Venezuelan opposition won the election. Venezuela's opposition and U.S. media outlets claim that there was fraud in the July 28 election based on the exit poll that's done by U.S. government-linked firm Edison Research, which works with the CIA-linked U.S. state propaganda organs and was active in Ukraine, Georgia, and also in Iraq. Next, Blinken fails to see any of the thousands of war crimes being committed in Gaza, but in Venezuela, he sees things that aren't even there. There were over 1,000 foreign election observers in Venezuela from 110 countries monitoring the elections. The election result, which doesn't go your way, you have serious concerns. When you fail in your plot, you start giving moral lectures on democracy. You overthrow the elected government in Pakistan and impose your stooges. Next, activists in New York City. The U.S. protests in front of Fox News to denounce its lies against Venezuela and popular democracy and its active role in the ongoing coup against Venezuela orchestrated by U.S. imperialism. Hands off Venezuela.
The mainstream media, Fox News, is simply a mouthpiece to manufacture consent for meddling in Venezuela's affairs as a sovereign state, to protect the interests of capital. So we call for an end to sanctions now. We want justice, you say how?
We want justice, you say how?
Hands off Venezuela now!
Hands off Venezuela now!
We want justice, you say how?
We want justice, you say how?
Hands off Venezuela now!
And finally, U.S. sanctions impact. I lost my grandpa, I lost my uncle, I almost lost my mom and my little brother, all due to a lack of medical supplies. I suffered malnutrition, food insecurity, poverty, weeks, months without electricity or water services, add depression and anxiety. Do not explain Venezuela to me. You can see some of the hardships that Venezuelans have felt because of the U.S. sanctions. All right, let's get down to our first segment of the Q&A, and let me introduce our guests. Joining us first, we have Jill Clark-Galoob. Jill Clark-Galoob is an activist for peace and Latin American solidarity in several organizations, includes the Venezuela Solidarity Network, the Americas Without Sanctions Campaign, the Friends of Latin America, and the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, and her articles have been published in the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Counterpunch, Popular Resistance, and the Alliance for Global Justice. All right, Jill Clark-Galoob, welcome to Economic Divide.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Taking a look at the presidential election, you have again the U.S. coming out in opposition. It has come out rejecting the results, calling it bogus, and it's even backed the opposition to the hilt. Sounds like another Juan Guaido. Why is the U.S., you think, so eager to interfere in the elections in Venezuela, like it has done in the past, and again, in particular, when we see what it did with Guaido?
Well, the U.S., there are several things, but the U.S. has never forgiven Venezuela for taking back its oil profits and using them for the people of Venezuela. The United States was, and U.S. companies particularly, were getting ridiculous rates off the royalties from Venezuela's oil. And under President Hugo Chavez, and continued under Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan government keeps those profits for its own country, for the development of its country. And so that is one thing that the U.S. and corporations that run the U.S. government are not happy with Venezuela about. Another thing is that under President Hugo Chavez and continuing under President Maduro, Venezuela is a leader of Latin American integration. In other words, Latin American countries exercising their sovereignty to run their countries for the benefit of their own people, not respond to the dictates of the U.S. government and U.S. corporations, and to gain strength in this by joining together and also fostering South-South solidarity throughout the world. And the other reason that the U.S. government is so much against the Venezuelan project is that it is, as I heard a Venezuelan official say the other day, it does pose an extraordinary threat to the United States. But it's not the threat of military intervention, it's the threat of a good example. Venezuela, in the last 13 years, has provided low-income families with free or very low-cost housing, 5.1 million homes in a population of just 31 million. This means at least 1/3 of the population has benefited from this. This is a problem that's tremendous in the United States. And if people know more about the case of Venezuela, they will be demanding housing to resolve the tremendous homeless crisis that we have in the United States. And the examples go on with education and healthcare in particular.
All right, that's a very good point that she makes there. Let me bring in our next guest. We have Maria Fernanda Barreto joining us. She is a Venezuelan-based writer and director of the communications platform, and she has received an award for her work as a female communicator at the Khurshid International Media Festival that was held here in Iran, in Mashhad. Maria Fernanda Barreto, welcome to Economic Divide.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Taking a look at the presidential elections that was just held, the U.S. again has tried to interfere with Venezuela's political process, in essence really violating its sovereignty, because it has brought people out to the streets against the President Maduro, some who have followed the U.S. line. Why do you think that the U.S. keeps interfering in Venezuela's affairs and keeps wanting to oust Maduro?
Well, because all the imperialists, and especially USA, always want to control our resources. Venezuela have so many oil, gas, and gold, and rare earths. And Venezuela have also a very geostrategic position in our continent. And of course, Venezuela have a great history, putting in front of the colonialist and the imperialist interests. And that's why they always try to control our life and support that kind of opposition who really are they're Muppets. They are just Muppets of that imperialist interest in our country. And like you say, they support Guaidó, they support Carmona Estanga, they support all of coups in our history, because they always want to control our destiny, and they don't accept that we are free and we are an independent nation.
All right. Well, Jill, let me turn to you here. We're looking at the U.S. The other destructive role that it plays is placing deadly sanctions against Venezuela, where one report indicated years ago, you probably are aware of this one, that not only did Venezuela lose billions of its currency in dollars overall, but also 40,000 lives were lost. If it weren't for the U.S. sanctions, how much better do you think Venezuela's economy would be?
If it weren't, as is true of all of the countries that are suffering from the illegal, unilateral, coercive measures imposed by the United States and by some of the countries of Western Europe, countries would have much more development. And that would be true as well in Venezuela. The Venezuelan authorities have talked about, more schools, more health care, even more housing, more infrastructure that would be available. And it's not just 40,000 lives. That was 40,000 lives in 1 year in Venezuela. There have been estimates as much as 100,000 lives lost in Venezuela because of the crippling sanctions that caused the oil revenue to go from billions of dollars down to 1% of what the country was receiving in oil revenue before this. So it has had a tremendous impact on the country. But the good news is that the Venezuelan government and people have managed to make tremendous strides in overcoming these sanctions. The most important thing is that they have learned to grow their own food. About 5-6 years ago, Venezuela depended on imports for 85% of its food. The country, through programs such as urban agriculture, where people in the city of the very densely populated city of Caracas have gardens on rooftops of buildings, people are now producing over 90% of the food that Venezuelans eat. So this has been very important. And also some wise decisions have been made by the government, and now inflation is at 1%, the lowest that it's been in the past 39 years. So all of this has been through a lot of suffering and struggle of the Venezuelan people. And a lot of suffering over the last few years would have not taken place because of sanctions, but it's hard to estimate how much more developed the country would be had it not been for
The program. The Venezuelan economy suffered from years of U.S. sanctions, which it does to this day, along with low oil prices from years ago. But it appears that the economy is actually bouncing back from its low of years ago. Let's take a look at some of the indicators that reflect this positive trend. First up, reports do suggest that the economy is moving up slightly, moving from a minus 30% GDP that you see there from the year 2020, 0.5% for 2021, and then 6.5% in 2022. Not bad. Information suggests optimism for Venezuela, linking the increase in oil profits for Venezuela, and that's partly due to the boycotting of Russian oil. And it's projecting a 5.6% GDP growth for the year 2023. That actually, at this point, did pan out to be just that. And then for the year 2024, 5%. At this point, Nicolas Maduro, the president, has said that Venezuela's economy grew more than 5% in 2023, which it did, 5.6%, and growth will reach 8% this year. Let's find out if that happens for them. Next, when it comes to oil production, although it is still far from what used to be 2.5 million barrels that it produced at the height of the oil boom, well, today that figure is much lower. It produces 820,000 barrels for the year 2023. 70,000 more than a year ago and almost 20% more than 2 years ago. Well, international sanctions imposed by the White House have prevented this figure from increasing even further. President Nicolas Maduro, well, he has projected, another projection, that Venezuela will produce at least 1.2 million barrels of oil per day in 2024, hoping to reach the 2 million barrels per day by the following year as part of a broader strategy to revitalize the country's economy. Next, positive economic trends, well, it's based on improvements in certain sectors. Trade and services is one of them, oil, and also the mining sector is another, in addition to the growth of sectors like food processing and pharmaceuticals. These have contributed to the positive trend. Well, wages for work in 2024 has ended up representing barely 10% of the GDP, when back in the year 2010 it exceeded 40% of the total economy. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, he has highlighted the development of what he calls 18 productive engines to ensure that the country can produce everything the Venezuelan household needs. These productive references are for various sectors. Some of them include agriculture, tourism, and manufacturing, and of course revitalizing the petrochemical sector and expanding investments in gas production is another thing that is involved in this. Let's bring back our guests for the in-depth section and see what they think. Rejoining us is Jill Clark-Gulub, who's an activist for peace and Latin American solidarity in several organizations. Jill, welcome back. We are looking at the U.S. obsession when it comes to regime change, in particular in Venezuela. It's been going on for quite some time, and of course the natural oil and gas reserves is at the core of it, maybe. But hasn't the push for regime change been so extreme that it has backfired, not only in terms of Venezuela and U.S. aspirations, but also other Latin American countries that look at this negatively? What do you think?
Yes, certainly this is true. And I think that we see this not only with Venezuela, but in general when the United States tries to impose sanctions around the world. We saw this in the response to the Russian operation in Ukraine, when the United States used the United Nations to have votes about imposing sanctions on Russia. And so many countries of the world did not vote against the United States resolutions, but did not vote for them either. And we can see that a majority of the world's population lives in countries that is not going along with the United States sanctions on Russia and other countries. So, yes, I think that this is leading countries to find alternatives, such as the BRICS, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Latin American countries as well are taking notice. I think that the progressive governments of Mexico and Honduras in particular are very wary of the United States, and their votes in the Organization of American States show that even though this recent vote in the OAS a couple of weeks ago about wanting to punish Venezuela, and somehow Venezuela is no longer a member of the Organization of the American States, but it was very interesting to see the vote. And Honduras and Mexico are two of the countries, most of the countries of the Caribbean also refused to go along with the United States. They all abstained or were not present for the vote so that the resolution could not pass. And I think for the countries of Brazil and Colombia, who are under tremendous pressure from the United States to do as the United States wants, have to think a lot before doing this. Unfortunately, there are countries such as Argentina, the coup government in Peru, the government of Ecuador that are going along with the U.S. agenda. But I think that, and those are part of the new fascist wave that we see not only in Latin America, but in Europe. And that's very unfortunate. But the countries that value their sovereignty are very much disillusioned with the United States telling them how to run things.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. Let's bring back Maria Fernanda Barreto, who is a Venezuelan-based writer and director. Maria, welcome back to Economic Divide. I'd like to continue with a train of thought here, which is the U.S. sanctions regime, obviously leveled against Venezuela. It has impacted its economy to a very high degree. And my question to you is whether other Latin American countries actually are taking note of the U.S. approach in using the sanctions as a weapon against countries, and how that maybe have backfired against the U.S. Do you think that has been the case?
Well, maybe not other governments, but obviously other peoples, the people of other countries are looking at that kind of pressure that the USA are making against Venezuela, and now Venezuela have more support of the people of other countries, also the countries of Africa, of the countries of Middle East, because I think now so many people who doesn't understand what it really happened in Venezuela knows and could see by their own eyes that USA really are try to control our destiny and don't respect our sovereignty. No, I think it could be really important for the people of the global south to support Venezuela in this moment. And I think all the actions, the terrorist actions that USA has been doing against could show the truth to the people of the global south.
The negative role that U.S. sanctions have had on Venezuela is impossible to ignore. The U.S. government barred oil purchases, froze government bank accounts, prohibited the country from issuing new debt, and seized tankers bound for Venezuela. One would think that it should be self-evident that any account of Venezuela's economic contraction would place economic sanctions in a central role. Venezuela's economy has been highly dependent on oil, which accounts for more than 90% of exports and more than half of fiscal revenue. When oil revenues rise, regardless of whether it happens as a result of increased production or prices, the economy expands. When they tank, so does the GDP. But just like the opposite effect that sanctions have had on certain countries like Iran, U.S. sanctions helped Venezuela develop its domestic capacities. One example is in the field of agriculture, where it has expanded and helped Venezuela provide many of its basic food supplies. There is no reason for Venezuela's economy not to flourish. As we have seen, it has somewhat rebounded from its lows of stagflation and hyperinflation. Now, with joining a grouping of countries like Iran, Russia, and China, and the likes, it can move past these illegal U.S. sanctions and truly get what it deserves, an economy for the people. That does it for this edition of the program. Thank you for being with us and for watching it. If you liked it, do send us a comment. And more importantly, if you didn't, contact information is here. Tell us what you think. From me, Kaveh Tafway, and the team here at Economic Divide, it's goodbye until the next program.